Alright, because the Earth is spinning around in space, if we point our camera up to the sky, it's going to look like the stars are also spinning around, all around in space. So, in order to take a star trail photo, the best way to do it is to take a bunch of 30-second exposures, one after the other, and then combine them later on the computer. So, in order to take a star trail shot, you need three essential things. You need a DSLR with a continuous shooting mode, which most cameras should have. You also need a tripod, and you also need a external shutter release. Or if your camera can't take an external shutter release, all you need is just a rubber band and maybe like a little eraser to wedge in between the shutter button and the rubber band. We'll talk about that in a minute. um, but just quickly before we start getting into all the camera settings and all that, let's just look at some things that you might want to consider before you take your star trails shot. Because we're outside and sometimes it gets cold out there and we're going to be taking pictures for 20 minutes up to 5 hours, we're going to want a 100% charged battery. And if you have a battery grip for your camera, slap that on your camera too just to get more power. The next thing that you're going to want to do is find an interesting foreground and then make sure the sky is clear with minimum light pollution. The foreground is actually almost kind of more important than the sky itself. Because, I mean, if you just take a picture of the sky only, you'll get a star trail shot, but anyone can do that, you know? It's kind of like, let's just aim the camera up at the sky and take a star trail photo. It's not really that majestical or intriguing. So, if you have an interesting foreground, that can just make all the difference to your photo. Now, it will be harder to do fantastic star trail shots in the city because the city gives off light pollution in the atmosphere and it causes the sky to kind of glow, so you can't even really see the stars when it's glowing that bright. So you might have to go out in the country, and you're going to want to start taking the shot when it gets really dark. So 90 minutes after sundown is a good time to start it. Another thing that you're going to want to take a precaution of is if you are shooting in a cold, damp night, fog can build up on your lens. So you're either going to want to get anti-fog cloths, hand warmers to wrap around your lens, or a miniature fan to constantly blow wind onto your lens to make sure that it doesn't get all fogged up. You're going to want to make sure that the noise reduction feature in your camera is turned off. If it is turned on, what will happen is you're going to take a photo and then your camera is going to be processing that image for the amount of length that you took the photo of to get rid of the noise. So if you took a 30-second exposure, it's going to take about 30 seconds to process that image and remove the noise from it. And you can't be taking another picture during that time. So you're going to want to definitely turn the noise reduction feature off on your camera if that's there. A few more facts. If you point your camera north, particularly to the North Star, that North Star is the center point where all the other stars will rotate around. So if you point it north, you will actually see the circular star trails. There's actually an app for Android phones where you can point your phone up to the sky and you can actually see an entire map of where the stars are in the sky. And that application is called the Google Sky Map. It's actually pretty useful because you can just quickly point it up to the star and you see the North Star right there. You know exactly where it is. You can aim your camera in that direction. Bada bing, bada boom. You got your picture. More facts. If you are zoomed out, you will see that the star trail will take a longer time to render a longer line. So if you're zoomed in, it's going to take maybe, if you're using like a 400 millimeter lens, it's only going to take about 20 minutes for a star trail to go from the very left edge of the frame to the very right edge of the frame. However, if you're using something like a 17 millimeter lens, it's going to take about 4.5 hours for the star trail to start at the left edge of the frame and then end up at the right edge of the frame. So alright, so now let's start taking the actual star trail sequence. The very first thing before we actually do that is I'd like to take some kind of like bright pictures of the entire scene, because the main sequence when you're going into that burst of all those 30-second exposures, those are actually pretty dark usually when you're photographing that. So what I like to do is set my camera up, put it on a tripod tightly so it doesn't move around. Focus on the brightest star in the sky. If your autofocus is having a hard time focusing on the star and it can't lock in, turn off autofocus and just go into manual focus, and move the focus ring into the infinity symbol. And then, of course, do a little guess and checking. Take a picture, look on the back of your LCD screen to make sure it's sharp enough for you, and if it is, then stick with that and don't touch the focus anymore throughout the rest of the sequence. If there's a bright object way out in the distance, like maybe a ship on the water, or maybe a house is way out there on a mountain or something, focus on that and call that good enough. That will be just as good as focusing on a star. And then I like to raise the ISO to a high ISO, like something like maybe 800 or 1600. And then I like to put the aperture, open up the aperture all the way it can go. So that's 2.8 on the lens that I'm using. And then the shutter speed, I usually just leave at 30 seconds. Although if I have my cable release, I can bump that up to like a minute or whatever. Maybe I could even do 5 minutes, and then I could get a lower ISO number, so I wouldn't get as much noise. But it's up to you. But basically, the reason why I do that is because the first picture you take, it's kind of nice that you can like make the picture brighter. In this picture, I took several frames with me just light painting the tree, and I did that I took like 5 different shots of just the tree being lit up by the flashlight. Then when I was all done with that, I put the flashlight down and made my camera take the actual sequence of the star trails. So you don't have to calculate how many shots you need to take in order to get a correct exposure or anything like that. You just maybe take a good picture, the very first shot that's kind of bright and nice looking, and also maybe do a few light paintings in the same composition. And then when that's just done, just put the settings back down to ISO 200, the widest aperture, and 30 seconds, somewhere around there. And then just initiate the sequence. So in order to initiate the sequence where we start taking one 30-second exposure after the other, what we're going to have to do is put our camera into continuous shooting mode. This is where you hold down the shutter button and the camera keeps taking an exposure one after the other like an automatic machine gun. It'll just go click, 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 click if you have a camera that can do a fast frame rate. If it's slower, it might just go click, click, click. But this doesn't matter because we're going to be using 30-second exposures, so it doesn't need to be fast. But nevertheless, when you hold down the button, it's going to take all the pictures one after the other. And there's different ways cameras label this feature. Sometimes it's labeled like this. Other times it's labeled like this. It's up to you. So look in the camera manual if you don't know what it's called or if your camera even has it. After we have our camera set to that mode, we need to now get a external cable release. This is a little thing that plugs into your camera, and it's just like the shutter button. You can push the shutter button and it takes a picture. The only difference is that with these you can actually push the shutter button in and lock it in place. So this is sort of just like an automatic mechanical way of holding your finger down on the button for hours on end. Now if your camera does not accept external shutter releases, what you can do is just grab a few rubber bands and wrap them around your camera so that the rubber band is kind of going over the shutter button. Then what you can do is wedge in a little eraser or maybe a wad of paper, some little tiny object that goes in there, and just wedge it in so that there's enough weight being pushed down on the button. And once you got that set up, you can just leave the camera as is, and it will just take 30-second exposures continuously without any more tampering. One last thing I forgot to mention was the white balance. If you're on tungsten white balance, your picture is going to look very cold and blue. If you are on the shade white balance, your picture is going to look very warm and orange. If it's on anything in between that, it's going to look purple.